There are certain things in the Christian doctrine, and if you want to know why I'm not a Christian, one of the reasons for that is because I can't throw my weight behind a doctrine that fails so utterly to condemn one of the worst atrocities in human history.
Okay. You know that there is condemnation of slave trading in Scripture?
Yes.
Right, okay.
So it's about... Like I say, there are things that are condemned and there are things that are condoned in the Bible, but when we get down to the specificity, so for instance, you could talk about in the New Testament where it says that the slaver or some phrase like that is not going to make it to heaven. Well, okay, but that's quite broad. You go into the book of Exodus and you find very specific examples of how to treat individuals who are in what might be called voluntary servitude.
Right.
Now, the Bible might not call that slavery, or it might call it slavery but mean voluntary servitude, but by today's standard, we certainly consider it to be at the very least immoral and at the very worst slavery.
Yeah, so there's a lot of context on the topic of slavery, and often we tend to retroject our understanding of kind of North American slave trade into the biblical text, and we have to understand the concept of slavery in its own context. And I know you've done a lot of videos on this, which I have watched, so I'm aware of your material on this. But in terms of Hebrew slavery, it was something that was When someone it was often a voluntary way of paying off debt. So if you entered into debt and you couldn't pay it, then you could volunteer yourself into slavery as a way of paying off debt. You're familiar with that? I'm sure.
So let's take that as the context in which we're working in. So it's a kind of voluntary debt payment agreement. It's like an employee-employer kind of contract situation. So imagine that we're in such a situation in the modern age. It's a voluntary servitude, just like having a job, for instance, where you're not paid but you're given somewhere to live or something like that. And then you take an actual quote, such as from Exodus 21. Anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be punished. Good start. If the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Two problems. First is that even if it's a voluntary servitude contract, I don't think it's ever permissible to allow the person in charge of that contract to mercilessly beat a slave as long as they don't die. If they get up after a few days and everything's fine. Secondly, referring to them as their slave, as their property, is not the most enticing of prospects. Right.
So this is in Exodus 21. But so the argument is that so is it permissible then for a slave master to beat his slave to the point of death with a strike of death, and then he gets away with it? Basically, that's the moral objection that's made. But when you look at the context of this text in Exodus 21. We see that it goes on to say, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. I don't think it's literally talking about eyes and teeth, but it's making a more general point that if someone is abusing his slave and beating him such that he's causing bodily harm, then there's punishment for that the slave gets to go free, the guy's going to lose his...
Well, that can't be the case if in the verse that I quoted, we're talking specifically about beating a slave with a rod, and it doesn't just say, I'll remind you, that this slave shall only be punished if they die. It says the slave will be punished if they die, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two. Recovery implies physical injury, and not to be punished implies that they are not to be punished. Now, there may be exceptions to that, but the point of the matter is that if you think it's okay in any context, and you can say like that the verses you quoted are making a more general point, well, who are you to decide what's making a general point and what's making a specific point? And again, I would stress that since slavery is so obviously a moral abomination, why would it be so unclear? If God is not the author of confusion, then God can't be the author of these passages.
So slavery in the North American, 19th century sense certainly is an abomination. But the slavery in the biblical sense, at least in the Hebrew sense, is I think it has a lot of context which we can get into.
Well, let's do so.
Yeah,
I've been waiting. I mean, look, I think that it's also about 18th century American slavery was horrendous. So is any version of slavery in any context, in any point in history, which allows the slave master to beat their slave with a rod. Surely you must agree with this.
There is a form of discipline in slavery, yes, but the context makes it clear that they were not supposed to produce permanent bodily harm.
I'm not asking you to describe slavery. I'm asking you to offer a moral judgment upon it. Do you think it's morally permissible for anybody, even if it is a voluntary service contract, to beat their slave with a rod and specifically not be punished if they get up after recovering after a few days, recovery implying that they have been physically harmed.
But you understand the point that I'm making, that they were not supposed to cause permanent bodily harm.
Even so, and I still don't know if that is entirely reliable, because you could just as easily make the case that they were talking specifically about the bodily parts you're mentioning because they're particularly important to certain areas of life. Even if it was just somebody's arm being broken, I still think that that's morally indefensible.
Yeah, I would say that that would be morally indefensible, which is why they would lose the slave if they caused permanent bodily harm, such as someone's arm being broken.
But they are not to be punished if the slave gets up after recovering from the beating
yeah,
with
but
a rod.
The word punish there in Hebrew means punishment by death. So they get the death penalty. If they kill the slave, they get the death penalty.
Okay, what about Numbers 31?
Yeah.
I don't want to run out of time here. I'm sure you're familiar. Actually, I don't know where we are on time.
About 30 seconds.
Okay, we'll try it for 30 seconds. Numbers 31, of course, in fact, I'll just quote it. Moses instructs the following they're attacking the Midianites and essentially committing a genocide against the Midianites. And Moses instructs his combatants, "Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, I'm not entirely sure what a bunch of aggressive males could want with a bunch of virgin girls. I'll leave that up to the imagination of the audience. But to me, this seems not just slavery in terms of like a voluntary service contract. This seems a fairly grotesque form of sexual slavery being quite clearly advocated here. Even in the course of war, I don't think that's acceptable.
1 minute to respond.
Okay, so this is in number 31, and so on the issue of the killing, so there's a whole range of moral arguments that we need to get into on genocide.
I understand. Yeah. So
and on whether it's always wrong to kill innocent people, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not convinced that it's always wrong to kill innocent people.
Me neither. But it's always wrong to keep them the sex slaves.
And I also think, in terms of killing innocent people, I think it's difficult to make moral judgments on an omniscient being who has access to things that can happen in the future as consequences.
Right. Maybe we could just put it up to a divine mystery why the moral creator of the universe would allow people to take sex slaves, but I don't think that's really convincing me.
Yeah, I confess I do struggle with this text, so I don't know the answer to that question. But I think it's one of the more difficult.
I'm glad, because I've seen so many people try to defend it. I really like that answer. But what I would say is that what we're discussing here is why I'm not a Christian and why you are a Christian. The reason I'm not is because, like you, I look at texts like this, I'm confused by them at the very least, and I turn to people for answers. They can't be found. What we are left with is having to throw our hands up in the sky and saying, maybe the author of morality can permit sexual slavery, and that's just not good enough for me.
So you, I'll just make one final statement. You do have a good point on this text, that it is difficult to understand what's going on here. So I fully admit that. Yeah.
Super. Yeah.